Hello, youth practice friends. Today we're going to read another story. This one is called The Hunter and the Quail. It's a story about working together, which we need to do more than ever in this stay-at-home time. And I think we could also see this as a story about different kinds of leadership. Some good kinds of leadership, some not so good. A quail, by the way, is kind of a small bird. This picture is of a king quail. That's the name of this kind of quail. It's not that this bird sits on a throne and orders people around, as far as I know. But he or she looks like the quail in the story. So let's read it, and afterward we'll have 3 questions to talk about and think about. The Hunter and the Quail, a story about working together. Once upon a time, there was a wise quail who was a teacher to all the great family of birds. They called him the sage. All the birds, including the sage, lived together in a vast green forest where there were dense thickets in which to hide their nests, clear deep springs for drinking and washing, and seeds of every sort to eat. They were happy living there. One day a hunter came into the forest with a large net for trapping birds. Even worse, he knew how to attract birds by imitating their calls and songs. On this day his trick worked perfectly. As he sang out, the quail nearby thought their friends and relatives were calling them. Deceived and curious, the birds crept closer and closer to where the hunter was hiding. When the birds were near at hand, the wily hunter slipped the net out from under his coat and flung it over them. Surprised and trapped, the birds were piled topsy-turvy in a brown-feathered heap. Then the satisfied hunter stuffed them into his wicker basket and carried them home. He would sell them later in the marketplace. For many days after, the hunter returned to the forest and each time captured a full net of birds. The sage himself was never trapped, but he was troubled by the cruel hunter, so he called his family together to teach them to escape from the net. He said, "This tricky hunter believes that he can trap us all, but we can stop him. Tomorrow, when you feel the weight of the net, take a close look at the webbing. Look for an opening between the cords. When you find one, thrust your head through. Then beat your wings in a flurry and take to the air. Working together, trusting each other, we can lift the net and fly off with it to the nearest bush. There the net will lie tangled in the branches, and you can wriggle out from underneath." Since the birds did not want to be caught, they decided to try the sage's plan. The next morning, when the hunter came back to the forest, he placed himself in a thicket and began to call. Soon a large flock of birds drew near. At once he whisked out his net and cast it over the flock. But before he could bundle the birds into his basket, the net rose into the air and came to rest on a thorn bush, whereupon all the birds scrambled out from underneath and flew off. They had escaped. When evening came, the hunter was still busy untangling his net. He returned home empty-handed. Day after day, the hunter was outwitted by the birds. Night after night, he came home with an empty basket. Finally, the hunter's wife became angry and said to him, "Every night you return without any birds. You must be a foolish hunter. We shall surely starve." "Oh no, my dear," replied her husband. "I am not a fool. These birds have tricked me by working together, but it is hard to cooperate forever. Soon they will lose trust and begin to squabble, and then I will trap them. Birds shall be back in my basket, and the smile will be back on your face." Sure enough, it was not long afterwards that one of the quail flew down to the forest floor and landed on another bird's head. "Who stepped on my head?" cried the dazed quail, shaking his crest. "I did," said the other. "It was an accident, and besides, you stood right beneath me." "Don't blame it on me, you stupid bird. You would fly into a fire and think it was water." Don't call me stupid. I suppose you think you are so smart you could escape the hunter all by yourself. The sage overheard this bickering back and forth. He thought to himself, if the other quail turn to such quarreling, they will no longer be able to lift the net together. Still, my family must be safe. Those who wish to live in peace shall come with me now, and we can learn to trust one another. Together we will overcome the threat of any hunter, no matter how clever he is. Then the sage and his flock departed. The next day the hunter returned to the forest and gave out his bird call. The birds that had chosen to remain behind listened and drew near him. Then the hunter flung his net over them. This was the moment for working together and flying off to safety. But the birds began to argue. One said to the other, "You never help enough with the net. That's not fair. You should try harder to pull your own weight." The other answered, "I do more than you jabbering bunch of feathers. This time it's your turn to work." And while the two birds insulted each other, ordering each other about, the hunter gathered them up and stuffed them into his basket. He took them home to a happy wife. So it was in ancient times that quarreling birds were captured by hunters, while those who learned to work together could escape the cleverest foe. So there are many interesting details that we could explore in this story, but I finally settled on 3 questions which you can think about and talk about at home. Question number 1 is, how can we rise up together? In this story, the birds fly together to lift the net so that they can escape from the hunter. They rise up by working together. So the question is, how can we rise up together like the birds? This is a really important question in our difficult times right now. We need to work together to help each other, but how can we do that? One way we need to work together for now is by staying home and practicing social distancing. Now, social distancing isn't a very nice term, is it? Because we don't really want to be lonely, do we? And we don't want to be unfriendly, but we do need to keep our physical distance from most other people now to slow down the spread of the coronavirus. And that's tough. It's harder to talk to people over computers or iPhones than it is in real life, isn't it? Especially when the software has problems. So we're doing some hard work there. These days we have to practice a lot of patience. Do you remember that patience is one of the paramitas, the heroic practices? It's really true. Every time you practice patience these days, you're being a hero. Let me share my own example. So for adults, Clouds and Water now has meditations on Zoom so that people can meditate together, even though they're not physically coming into the center. I'm finding it helps me just to see that other people are meditating at the same time that I am, so I'm trying to attend those sessions on the computer now. It's funny actually, in some ways it's easier to do meditation on Zoom because there isn't much talking, and we save a lot of time not driving into the center. So, what about you? What are some ways that you're keeping connected with your friends and teachers, even over a computer? What are some ways that you can work together with your family at home? Do you find you have to practice patience with all of this? Now, here's something to try. This is a suggestion from the book. In your family, pick some activity tonight, like setting the table, for example, and do it all together as a family, like the cooperative birds did to lift the net. Pay attention to how that feels. Does it feel good to work together? Question number 2 is, what qualities do you think are good in a leader? Let's talk about the different kinds of leadership that we see in this story. As we're looking at this, ask yourself, what kind of qualities do you think are good in a leader? First up, the sage Quail. Well, the sage quail is calm. He's developed skill in mindfulness so he can stay present in a difficult situation. He pays attention to what's going on. He's compassionate. He's concerned about the safety and the welfare of the other birds. And he's knowledgeable or wise. He has experience and knows something about how the world works, so he can come up with a plan to help the other birds. Now let's look at the hunter. In his favor, the hunter, we have to admit, is clever. But he uses his intelligence to manipulate the birds, tricking them into thinking he's their friend. That's not only dishonest, but it uses the good intentions of the birds against themselves. That's not very nice. Obviously, he's not their friend. You might say the hunter is also self-centered. It's probably a good quality that the hunter is taking care of his family, but you could also argue that he's only interested in taking care of himself and his family, not the other birds. So if you remember the Eightfold Path and right livelihood, there's a question there. Is the hunter practicing right livelihood? And if he's not, would you like a leader to be practicing right livelihood? And then we have the quarreling birds. Well, seems like they're pretty self-centered. They think everything is about themselves. They don't think about the safety of the other birds very much. They're also vindictive. They hold grudges. Because they only think of themselves, they're constantly reacting to insults that they think are coming from the other birds. And I hate to say it, but they're kind of ignorant. This is the opposite of knowledge or wisdom. They don't really understand how the world works. They spend most of their time arguing and fighting, so they don't know how to make a plan to save the other birds. They don't even realize that they are falling into the hunter's trap. And they're disorganized. I don't know, is that a good or bad quality or neither? Maybe you can think about that. So, what kind of qualities do you think are good in a leader? Now, take those good qualities and practice them yourself, because we can all be leaders in whatever we do. The thing about human beings is that we're actually a lot like the birds in this story. We tend to move in flocks. We tend to look at other people around us for ideas as to what we should be doing. And we pick up on the emotions presented by other people, whether we realize it or not. This is why yawning is contagious, for example, or why laughing spreads from person to person. So that means that you can be a leader just by doing something positive. It doesn't have to be something big. Maybe you could give your parent a hug, or you could not complain when it's time to do chores. Little things like that mean more than we think. Okay, here's a more difficult question for you. Question number 3. Did the sage quail do the right thing? When the sage quail noticed the bickering birds, he led the peaceful birds of the flock away. Here's the thing, though. None of us are peaceful all of the time, are we? I think we all have our moments when we argue with people. So I know it's just a story, but was the sage quail right to just leave those other birds behind? Shouldn't he have tried to talk some sense into them first? Or maybe did he realize that they were so quarrelsome that they were too much of a danger to the rest of the community? That's a tough one. What would you do in this story if you were the sage quail? Would you try to reason with the quarreling birds? And what would you do if they didn't want to listen to you? So those are some questions to think about and talk about. The book ends with this passage. So it was in ancient times that quarreling birds were captured by hunters, while those who learned to work together could escape the cleverest foe. May we all work together to defeat the coronavirus. Stay home, stay safe, and wash your hands. I'll see you next time.